On a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1979, Stephen Jenkin drove his truck down the middle of his own field in Decatur County, Kansas. Got out and did something that stopped traffic on the county road. He pulled a soybean plant out of the ground. Right there, in the middle of a wheat field. Not to kill it, to show it. Dale Hutchins was the first car to slow down. He rolled his window halfway and squinted at the field like a man who couldn't decide if he was seeing a crop or a crime scene. Because what Stephen Jenkin had done, what anyone standing on that county road could plainly see, was plant two crops in the same field. Wheat on the left, soybeans on the right. Row by row, side by side, running all the way to the tree line like Stephen had taken a ruler to the earth and drawn a line between the old world and something nobody in Decatur County had a name for yet. Dale rolled his window all the way down. "Stephen, what in the Lord's name are you doing to that field?" Stephen looked at the soybean plant in his hand. Looked at Dale. Looked back at the field. "Farming it twice," he said. He got back in his truck and drove on. By sundown, everyone in Decatur County knew. By the end of the week, they had a name for him. Crazy Two-Crop Jenkins. They said it with a smirk, with a slow shake of the head at the co-op. With that particular tone Kansas farmers reserve for men who have clearly lost the plot. Stephen never argued. He never explained. He never defended himself at the diner or the grain elevator or the equipment show. He just kept planting. And 10 years later, when the farm crisis hit Decatur County like a freight train with no brakes, when wheat prices fell through the floor and the banks started calling and neighbors started losing land their grandfathers had broken their backs to earn, Stephen Jenkin was the only farmer on his road who didn't flinch. Because while everyone else had one crop and one prayer, Stephen had two. Let me tell you how that happened. Welcome back. And if you're new here and this story already has you hooked, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because we tell stories like this every week. And you don't want to miss what happens next. Now let me tell you about Stephen Jenkin. Because to understand what he did to that field and why it mattered, you need to understand who he was before he ever pulled a soybean plant out of the ground in front of Dale Hutchins. Stephen Jenkin was born in 1921, the third generation of Jenkin men to work the same 400 acres in Decatur County, Kansas. His grandfather had broken that land with a mule and a borrowed plow. His father had kept it through the Dust Bowl by sheer stubbornness and rationed water. And Stephen had watched both of them do it, quietly, without complaint, with the kind of patience that only comes from knowing that the land was there before you and will be there long after. He was not a big man, not loud, not the kind of farmer who held court at the co-op or argued seed prices at the diner. He had a gray-bearded face that looked like it had been left out of there for 50 years, which it had, and hands so calloused they barely felt a fence wire anymore. He moved through his days at one speed, deliberate. When something broke on the farm, Stephen fixed it correctly the first time, even if that meant taking twice as long. His neighbors called it slow. His father had called it right. His wife, Carol, called it the thing that drove her absolutely crazy and saved them more times than she could count. Stephen's only goal, the one thing that organized every decision he made from January to December, was to hold on to that land, not to expand it, not to profit spectacularly from it, just to keep it in the family name, the way his grandfather had kept it, the way his father had kept it, for one more generation and then one more after that. The land wasn't an asset to Stephen Jenkin. It was an argument he was having with time, and he intended to win. But Stephen had one quality that set him apart from every other farmer on his road, and it was this. Once he saw a better way to do something, he could not pretend he hadn't. He couldn't unknow it. Couldn't file it away, couldn't let tradition talk him out of it with a shake of the head and a, "That's not how we do things in Decatur County." Some men would call that stubbornness, some would call it a flaw. Stephen Jenkin called it nothing, because he never talked about it. He just acted on it. And in the spring of 1979, acting on it would cost him every friend he had in the county. For a while, Stephen's father, Earl Jenkin, died on a Wednesday in November of 1978. He went the way most Decatur County farmers went, quietly, in his sleep, after a lifetime of early mornings and late evenings and not nearly enough rest in between. He was 81 years old. He had never once missed a planting season. Stephen buried him on the Saturday, shook hands with the pastor, nodded at the neighbors who came to pay their respects, and went back to the farmhouse. Carol made coffee. Nobody said much. There wasn't much to say about a man like Earl Jenkin that the land didn't already say better. 2 weeks later, Stephen started going through his father's things. Most of it was what you'd expect. Old receipts, a pocket Bible with a cracked spine, a photograph of Stephen's grandmother standing in front of the original farmhouse, squinting into the sun the way people did before anyone told them to smile for a camera. Work gloves worn down to the lining, a broken watch nobody had gotten around to fixing. And then, at the bottom of a cardboard box that smelled like diesel and decades, Stephen found a manila envelope. It was unmarked on the outside. Inside were 12 pages, stapled together, slightly yellowed at the edges. The header read, United States Department of Agriculture, Experimental Intercropping Study, 1961. Wheat and soybean dual-row planting trials, Great Plains region. Stephen sat down on the floor of his father's bedroom and read it straight through. Then he read it again. The study was not complicated. Researchers in 3 Kansas counties had planted alternating rows of winter wheat and soybeans on test plots over 3 consecutive seasons. The soybeans, they found, fixed nitrogen in the soil, meaning they pulled it directly from the air and deposited it where the wheat roots could use it the following year. Input costs dropped, soil health improved, and critically, in 2 of the 3 seasons, the wheat yields on the intercropped plots came in above the control fields planted with wheat alone. 2 crops, 1 field, each one making the other stronger. Stephen folded the pages carefully, put them back in the envelope, and sat with it on his lap for a long time. The next morning, he drove to the county extension office in Oberlin and asked the agent there if he'd ever heard of the 1961 intercropping study. The man looked at him blankly. The what? Stephen drove home. He didn't say anything to Carol that evening. He ate dinner, washed up, and went to the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pencil. He drew a rough map of his south field, 100 acres, good flat ground, decent drainage. Then he started sketching rows. Wheat, soybeans, wheat, soybeans. He worked until midnight. By the time he went to bed, the plan was already finished in his head. The only thing left was the planting. Stephen started planting the south field on the 2nd Monday of April, 1979. The weather was good. Cool mornings, dry afternoons, the kind of Kansas spring that makes you believe the summer might not try to kill you this year. He worked alone, the way he did most things, moving up and down the rows with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to prove. He finished on a Thursday. By Friday, the county knew. It didn't take long in Decatur County. It never did. A neighbor drives past, sees something unusual, mentions it at the co-op. The co-op mentions it to the feed store. The feed store mentions it at the diner. And by the time the sun goes down on a Friday in a small Kansas town, a story that started with 1 man in 1 field has become everybody's business. Dale Hutchins was the first one to come out in person. Dale owned the John Deere dealership on the edge of Oberlin, had for 25 years, and he considered himself the authority on what worked and what didn't in Decatur County agriculture. Not because he farmed himself, but because he sold to the men who did, and in his mind, that amounted to the same thing. He drove out on a Saturday morning, pulled his truck to the shoulder of the county road, and stood there staring at Stephen's south field with his arms folded across his chest. Stephen walked over. Dale didn't say hello. He just pointed at the field. That soybeans? That's soybeans. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. Not a polite laugh. The kind that starts in the belly and doesn't apologize for itself. Stephen, he said, I've been selling equipment in this county since before you had gray in that beard. I have never, not once, seen a man plant soybeans in a wheat field and call it a plan. Stephen looked at the field. There's a first time for everything. Dale laughed again, got back in his truck, and drove away. That was the polite version of what followed. Stephen's brother Frank, who farmed the 240 acres directly to the north, didn't laugh. Frank did something Stephen found harder to take than laughter. He went silent, stopped returning calls, stopped driving past on his way to town. For Frank Jenkin, what Stephen had done wasn't just unusual. It was an embarrassment to the family name. A public announcement that one of the Jenkin boys had lost his footing. Frank had a reputation to protect. Stephen had apparently decided to throw his away. The nickname appeared about 2 weeks after planting. Someone at the co-op, nobody ever admitted who, started calling him Crazy Two-Crop Jenkins. Said it the first time with a grin, said it the second time louder. By the third time, everybody in the room was using it. Stephen heard it for the first time at the grain elevator on a Tuesday afternoon. The man who said it looked like he expected a reaction. Stephen bought his supplies and drove home. He had 100 acres of wheat and soybeans in the ground. The laughing could wait. The summer of 1979 was not a forgiving one in Decatur County. It came in hot and stayed that way. The kind of Kansas heat that bakes the topsoil into something that looks more like pottery than farmland, that makes you squint at the sky every morning, hoping for clouds that don't come. It was the kind of summer that separated the fields that had been farmed correctly from the fields that hadn't. Stephen watched his south field the way a man watches something he has bet everything on. He walked the rows in the early mornings before the heat settled in, crouching down every so often to check the soil, to look at the root systems, to see what the two crops were doing to each other and for each other. What he saw was exactly what the 1961 study had described. The soybeans were working. Their roots were fixing nitrogen into the soil, quietly, invisibly, the way good things often work, and the wheat alongside them was pulling that nitrogen up and using it. The wheat stood tall, taller, Stephen noticed, than the wheat in his north field, which he'd planted the traditional way. He didn't tell anyone that. He just watched. Harvest came in September. Stephen ran the wheat first, the combine moving up and down the south field in the dry autumn air. Then he went back through for the soybeans, a second pass that took 2 additional days and raised more than a few eyebrows from the county road. When the numbers came back from the elevator, Stephen sat with them at his kitchen table for a long time. His wheat had yielded 42 bushels per acre. The county average that year was 36. 6 bushels above average, from the same Kansas soil, under the same Kansas sun that had punished every farm in Decatur County equally. And on top of that, from the exact same 100 acres, he had harvested 28 bushels per acre of soybeans, a full second crop, a second income stream, from land that every farmer in the county had been taught to plant once and leave at that. Carol looked at the numbers, then she looked at Stephen. He poured himself a cup of coffee and didn't say anything. When the figures got around, and they always got around, the explanations started almost immediately. It was the soil on that south field, someone said. Always been good ground down there. It was the season, said another. Some fields just catch the rain different. It was luck, said a third. One good year doesn't prove a thing. Dale Hutchins said nothing publicly. That was the tell. Because Dale Hutchins always had something to say. At the equipment show, at the co-op, at the diner on a Tuesday morning, Dale filled silence the way some men fill a room, automatically and without effort. His silence on the subject of Stephen Jenkin's Southfield was louder than anything he could have said out loud. Stephen noticed. He didn't mention it. He went home and started planning the next planting season. The thing about being right is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a trumpet or a headline or a moment where everyone in the room stops and admits they were wrong. Being right, in Stephen Jenkin's experience, looked almost exactly like being ignored, except that the ignoring slowly changed in quality. Got quieter, got less certain, got more like the kind of silence that comes from a man reconsidering something he thought he already knew. Stephen planted the Southfield again in the spring of 1980, and again in 1981, and again in 1982, and 1983, and 1984. Same rotation, same alternating rows, same 2 passes at harvest. Same kitchen table at the end of each season, same numbers written on the same legal pad in the same deliberate hand. The wheat yield stayed above county average every single year. Not dramatically. Stephen wasn't the kind of man who did anything dramatically, but consistently, reliably. the way a well-built fence stays standing while the weather does its worst. And every year, on top of the wheat, there were the soybeans. A second harvest from land his neighbors were getting one harvest from. A second check when the first one wasn't enough. The fertilizer costs were what finally made people lean in. By 1982, with oil prices still volatile and input costs climbing year over year, the nitrogen bill was the thing keeping most Decatur County farmers up at night. They were buying what the soybeans in Stephen's field were making for free. His input costs had dropped nearly 35% compared to his neighbors on equivalent acreage. That wasn't luck. That wasn't good soil. That was a system working exactly the way a 50-year-old government pamphlet said it would. The nickname faded somewhere around 1983. Not all at once. Nicknames don't die cleanly in small counties, but gradually, the way a fire goes out when nobody feeds it. People still knew what it meant. They just stopped saying it to his face, and then they mostly stopped saying it at all. Brother Frank drove past the south field one afternoon that same year and slowed down without stopping. Stephen was walking the rows and saw the truck. Frank didn't wave, but he slowed down. In 5 years of silence, that was something. The moment Stephen heard about came secondhand through Carol, who heard it from a woman at church whose husband had attended the regional equipment show in Salina in the fall of 1983. Dale Hutchins, apparently, had been talking to a young farmer from Ellis County who'd asked about diversifying his operation. And Dale had said, not enthusiastically, not as a recommendation, but as a plain statement of observed fact, "There's a farmer in Decatur County named Jenkin who plants soybeans with his wheat. Been doing it 5 years. Numbers aren't bad. Numbers aren't bad." From Dale Hutchins in a room full of Kansas farmers about Stephen Jenkin. Carol told Stephen over dinner. He ate for a moment without responding. Then he said, "That'll do," and went back to eating. The farm crisis didn't arrive in Decatur County like a storm. It arrived the way a slow leak ruins a foundation, quietly, invisibly, until one morning you step on the floor and realize there's nothing solid left underneath. It started with the prices. Wheat, which had been trading at comfortable levels through the early part of the decade, began sliding in 1984 and didn't stop. By 1985, it had dropped to levels that made the numbers on a legal pad look like a different language, one where the math simply refused to work no matter how many times you ran it. A farmer who needed $4.50 a bushel to cover his costs and make his loan payments was getting $3.10. Then $2.90. Then less. And the interest rates that had seemed manageable during the boom years had climbed to 18%, sitting on top of land loans and equipment loans and operating loans like a stone nobody could lift. The foreclosures started in the spring of 1985 and didn't stop for 2 years. Stephen watched it happen from the same south field where it had all begun. He knew these men, had known them his whole life, bought equipment at the same dealership, delivered grain to the same elevator, sat in the same pews every Sunday morning. Good farmers, careful farmers. Men who had done exactly what their fathers had taught them to do, exactly the way Decatur County expected it to be done. One crop, one prayer, one basket, and the basket had a hole in it. The math on Stephen's kitchen table told a different story. In 1985, his wheat brought in $3.10 a bushel at 42 bushels per acre. That was $130.20 per acre. Tight, survivable alone, barely. But Stephen also harvested 28 bushels of soybeans per acre that same season, at $5.80 a bushel. That was another $162.40 per acre. Combined, his south field was generating $292.66 per acre, while his neighbors were generating $130 from the same amount of ground and scrambling to cover the difference with loans they couldn't repay. Stephen made his payments in October. He sat across from the bank manager, a man named Gerald Pratt, who had the look of someone delivering bad news so often it had stopped registering on his face, and handed over a check. Gerald looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Stephen. "You're one of the only ones this season," he said. Stephen nodded, picked up his hat, walked out into the October air. Driving home on the county road, he passed 3 farms he had known his whole life. One already had a notice posted at the gate. Another had equipment sitting idle in the yard in a way that told you everything without saying anything. A third had a for sale sign at the end of the driveway that looked like it had gone up recently and in a hurry. Stephen drove past all three without stopping. There was nothing to say. There never is. When the thing that needed saying went unsaid for 5 years, and now it was too late. He turned into his own driveway, parked the truck and sat in it for a while. The south field stretched out in front of him in the late afternoon light, wheat stubble on one side, turned soybean rows on the other. Quiet and unhurried, and still exactly what it had always been. 2 crops, 2 chances. He got out of the truck and went inside for dinner. It was October of 1985. The harvest was in. The crisis was at its worst, foreclosure notices going up on gates across Decatur County like a slow unwinding of everything a generation of farmers had built. Stephen had heard through Carol that Frank's operation was in trouble. Bad trouble. The kind where the bank stops sending letters and starts sending people. He hadn't reached out. That wasn't Stephen's way. You didn't push yourself into a man's grief, especially a man who had chosen silence over brotherhood for the better part of 6 years. If Frank wanted to come, Frank knew where the farm was. He always had. Stephen was walking the south field at dusk, the way he did most evenings after harvest, checking the turned soil, thinking about the next season, doing the quiet accounting that farmers do when nobody is watching. When he saw the truck pull up to the road shoulder, he recognized it immediately. The dented rear panel on the passenger side, the cracked left taillight Frank had never gotten around to fixing. Frank got out slowly. He looked older than Stephen remembered, which shouldn't have been a surprise. It had been years of hard seasons, and they showed. He walked to the field edge and stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the stubbled rows. Not at Stephen. At the field. Stephen walked over and stood beside him. They were quiet for a long time. The sun was going down behind the tree line to the west, turning everything that amber color that Kansas does better than anywhere else on earth. Somewhere down the road, a dog was barking at nothing. Frank spoke first. "You were right," he said. His voice was level. Flat. The voice of a man who had rehearsed a sentence so many times it had lost all its edges. "I should have listened. Back in '79. I should have at least tried it." Stephen didn't say anything. "I'm going to lose the North 40, Frank said. "Bank's calling the note. Can't cover it on wheat prices where they are." Stephen nodded slowly. He turned and walked back toward the equipment shed without a word. Frank stood at the field edge and watched him go, and for a moment it looked like that was all there was going to be. 2 brothers standing in the last light with nothing left to say. Then Stephen came back. He was carrying a canvas seed bag. Not a full one, just enough. He held it out to Frank without explanation, without ceremony, without a single word that could be mistaken for ration. "I told you so." Frank looked at the bag, then at his brother. "Soybeans?" he said. "For next spring," Stephen said. "If you've got ground left to plant." Frank took the bag. He held it with both hands the way you hold something you should have asked for a long time ago. He didn't say thank you. Stephen didn't need him to. That was the most either of them had spoken in 6 years. It was enough. The first farmer showed up at Stephen's gate on a Thursday morning in February of 1986. His name was Curtis Hale, and he farmed 280 acres 3 miles east on the same county road. He was younger than Stephen by about 15 years. With the look of a man who had spent the winter doing the kind of arithmetic that keeps you awake at 3 in the morning. He stood at the gate with his hat in his hands and asked if Stephen had a few minutes. Stephen had a few minutes. He had a few minutes for Curtis Hale that Thursday, and a few minutes for Roy Pitcher the following week, and a few minutes for the Alderman brothers the week after that. Word moved through a farming community the way water moves through soil, slowly, invisibly, finding every crack and opening until it gets where it needs to go. By March of 1986, Stephen was walking someone through his south field almost every other day. He never charged a cent. He walked them through the rows the way his father had walked him through fields as a boy. Pointing at the soil, explaining what the root systems were doing, showing them the difference in the ground where the soybeans had fixed nitrogen and the ground where they hadn't. He talked about planting intervals and row spacing and harvest timing. He answered every question twice, if it needed answering twice. And when a farmer asked him where the idea had come from, Stephen went to the house and came back with the manila envelope, the one from his father's cardboard box, the one that smelled like diesel and decades, and he let them read the 1961 USDA study themselves. Some of them asked if they could make a copy. Stephen said yes every time. Carol watched all of this from the kitchen window and said one evening that he was giving away the thing that had saved them. Stephen thought about that for a moment. "My father never got to use this," he said. "Spent his whole life farming the same ground I'm farming and never knew this pamphlet existed. It sat in a box in his bedroom until he was in the ground himself." He was quiet for a moment. "The least I can do is make sure someone uses it while they still can." Carol didn't argue with that. There wasn't anything to argue with. By the end of 1986, 4 farms in Decatur County were planting some version of Stephen's method. By 1988, it was 11. By the time the decade turned, the county extension office, the same office where the agent had looked at Stephen blankly 8 years earlier and asked the what, had quietly incorporated intercropping into their standard advisory literature. Nobody sent Stephen a letter about it. Nobody gave him credit in print. He didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't mention it. He was too busy answering the next knock at the gate. There was always another one. Stephen Jenkin died on a Monday morning in the spring of 2004, the same season he had always loved best. He had been slowing down for 2 years by then. The body eventually sends a bill for 50 years of Kansas weather and early mornings, and work that never fully stops. And his granddaughter Emma had been running the day-to-day operation since the previous autumn. He knew the land was in good hands. That was the only accounting that ever mattered to him. The funeral was held at the Lutheran Church in Oberlin on a Thursday. The pews were full in a way that surprised people who hadn't been paying attention and surprised nobody who had. Farmers from 3 counties. The county extension agent who had taken over from the man who'd given Stephen that blank look in 1979 and who had since built an entire advisory program around the intercropping methods Stephen had walked strangers through for free. Curtis Hale sat in the 3rd row, the Alderman brothers in the 5th. Even Dale Hutchins came, older and quieter than anyone remembered him, and sat near the back without saying much to anyone. Frank Jenkins sat in the front row beside Carol. He had planted soybeans alongside his wheat every season since that October evening at the field edge in 1985. He had kept the North 40. He had kept everything. The pastor spoke about Stephen's faith and his family and his devotion to the land. But everyone in that church knew what they were really there to mark. A man who had stood at the dividing line of his own field in 1979 with 3 neighbors watching from the road and their arms crossed and their minds already made up, and had planted anyway, had kept planting, had never once raised his voice in his own defense or asked the county for its approval or waited for permission that was never coming. The gravestone was simple, the way Stephen would have wanted it. Below his name and his dates, Carol had chosen 4 words. He farmed it twice. Below that, smaller, wheat and soybeans. 1979. Always. Emma runs the farm today. She is 34 years old and has her grandfather's eyes and his particular talent for silence. And she plants the south field every spring, the same way he taught her father, the same way her father taught her. When visitors come, students, journalists, younger farmers wanting to learn, she walks them through the rows the same way Stephen walked Curtis Hale through them in February of 1986. She answers every question. She still has the manila envelope. When people ask her what the most important thing her grandfather taught her was, she doesn't hesitate. He said 1 basket is just 1 dropped moment away from nothing, she tells them. 2 crops, 2 chances. That's not complicated. That's just arithmetic. She reaches down and pulls a soybean plant from between the wheat rows, roots and all, and holds it up the way her grandfather used to. He wasn't a genius, she says. He just refused to unknow what he knew. That's it. That's the whole story. She sets the plant back in the ground and keeps walking. The field runs all the way to the tree line. Wheat on one side, soybeans on the other. Same as it ever was. And that is the story of Stephen Jenkin of Decatur County, Kansas. A man who planted 2 crops when the whole county told him to plant 1, who survived a crisis that broke his neighbors, and who gave away everything he knew without keeping score. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about the baskets you're carrying and whether you've got more than one, then do something simple before you go. Hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it tells us that stories like this are worth telling. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Every week we bring you stories of ordinary people who made extraordinary decisions in quiet ways that changed more than anyone expected. Stephen Jenkin never asked for recognition, but the least we can do is make sure his story reaches someone who needs to hear it. Just like that pamphlet in his father's box reached him. See you next time.